All right, well, we are in the shop today and we are back to work on my AE86 Corolla build. So this is a vintage, nostalgia, simple build. The entire goal for this thing is simplicity and nostalgia. Now, we are gonna do performance driving with it. We're gonna take it up to the mountains, rip back roads. We're gonna drift it, we're gonna tandem it, we're gonna do all those things. But instead of our number one focus being the performance and functionality of the car, our number one focus is just enjoyment and nostalgia. Now, the reason we went carbureted was, again, simplicity and nostalgia. At the end of the day, when we're done with this thing, all we should need to work on this car is some screwdrivers and some jets. And that is the whole fun and the whole point of this thing. Now, that being said, bike carbs weren't my first choice. These are a really good option. They match the engine size really well. They work well, good throttle response. They still make all the good noises, but it's just not really what I had in mind when I decided to build this car this way. But what I did have in mind, I couldn't find until now. Finally found the exact setup I wanted to go on this car. So let me show you what we've got and then let's get into it. So what we have is a pair of side draft Webers. These are 48 DCOs. These came off a setup. So we've got the manifold to adapt them to our big port 16 valve head. And we got all the other stuff that we need to do this. This setup kind of fell into my lap. A friend of mine found it for sale. It was local, and this was really what I wanted from the beginning. The build was really based around the fact that I just wanted to put side draft Webers on something. So super stoked that we were able to find this setup at kind of the perfect timing. So I want to pull the bike carbs off, test fit those on, and just see what it looks like in comparison and go a little back to back with the bike carb setup. So that being said, enough jibber jabber, let's get to work. Yeah, that's what I was going for from the start. That looks good. This manifold fits way better too than the bike carb one. The only thing we had to do was put a stud in this back corner because you can't get a bolt in. But our throttle cable, oh yeah, that should work. Might be a little short. What a combo. Now that we've got our instant gratification of seeing what they look like on the engine out of the way, it's time to get them ready to actually be installed on the engine officially, without having to take them back off. So that starts with capping off these water lines that were underneath the stock intake manifold. These went to the factory throttle body, which we no longer have, so we no longer have a use for them. So capped them off and cut out the ones that we could. So from there, we need to make a throttle cable bracket. It came with a bracket, but it just wasn't gonna work with our cable, so we've gotta make our own. Pretty much par for the course, one of those things. I expected it, but I was hoping we might get lucky on this one. So it should be a pretty straightforward bracket. I grabbed some scrap aluminum, cut out a piece that was a little longer than I needed it to be just to make sure that we had enough length and we didn't come up short. And then it was time to clean it up, get it smoothed out. I always like to do this before I start bending just because that way it's easier to get all the edges cleaned up than if you're trying to do that on a piece with multiple bends in it. So now we need to mark our bends. I've measured where they need to go. So we put it in the press brake, throw a couple bends in it, and test fit it back on the carburetor. So we've got the rough shape figured out, but now we need to cut the excess off. Again, I left this long just in case. You never know, it's easy to measure wrong when you're accounting for the dimensions of bends and things like that. So I wanted to get it on there and make sure the cut was exact. So this simple project didn't turn into a lot more complicated project of me having to redo it multiple times. So while I'm working on this, Osway semi took apart the carbs just to clean everything up and specifically to polish up the trumpets. These were looking pretty rough. Now we plan to overhaul these. Again, this is the get it running phase. But while we had it off, while we had it apart, we thought we might as well polish these things up, make them look nice. So now I've got my bracket cut to shape. I need to work on the mounting hole. Now this mounting hole is pretty critical because it not only mounts the bracket, but it also holds the trumpet in. So there's not a lot of room for error. It's got to be pretty precise. So fortunately I was able to get it right and get the right hardware combination to make it all work. So now we're just putting the carbs back together, putting the trumpets back on so we can put everything back on the engine. Now, this is kind of test number 2 to determine what hardware is going to work best. The way these manifolds are designed, they're really tight in some areas for the bolt holes. So certain hardware works well, certain hardware doesn't, and this is really the time to figure all of that out. So when we're ready to really bolt this thing on, we know the combination of things that works. Now, we also want to test the throttle cable bracket, because if this doesn't work, it's back to the drawing board. But if it does work, that is another step closer to the end goal. That's one less thing to worry about, and we can move on down the road. All right, well, carburetors are back on, and boy, do they look good. Even with just the trumpets cleaned up a little bit, what a difference that made. We are gonna rebuild the carburetors, obviously internally, gaskets and stuff, but also replace a lot of this crusty old hardware, make them look brand new again. But that is in the make things look good stage of the build. This is the get things running stage of the build. So we bolted them back up. We are gonna have to yank them back off just to change the gasket. I gotta go grab one of those, but I wanted to see if my throttle cable bracket worked out, and fortunately it does. We had to open up the routing a little bit just to keep the pedal from being too heavy. There's a lot of mechanical parts you're moving with your foot, but it all feels good. It opens to wide open throttle. It's got slack, so we don't have to worry about it hanging open. A1, so that is one big system figured out. Throttle, linkage, done, sorted. Next up is getting fuel to the carburetors, and then that whole side of things is done, and getting ignition, getting spark to the spark plugs. Now that is where things could get a little complicated. You know, we're gonna try to read home off the distributor, and it could get a little messy. That's our one piece of technology in this whole combo here, is that ignition box. So I wanna do that first. If we can get spark and get spark at the right time, the rest of it is pretty straightforward. I mean, we could even fire it up with some starting fluid. So I wanna start there, see where that goes. If we can get that box checked off, man, we'll be in good shape to fire this thing up and even drive it around. So you know the deal. Enough jibber jabber, let's get to it. Oh, also don't forget, we've got these super nifty garage built magnetic koozies on garagebuildco.com. These things are lifesavers. So amazing when you're working in the shop to be able to just stick your full drink to anything. So we're gonna be using our new distributor instead of the one that came with the carbs. We're gonna save that one in case we wanna use the crank wheel setup. We're gonna try to use this one with the stock distributor. So we've got fresh wiring, we can start from scratch. Now, before we start wiring it, we need to determine where we want to put this. So let's get this thing mounted up, and then let's start wiring it. Cleaner doors somewhere, but I've already gone through this whole dilemma. I might have to mount it on the other side, away from the distributor, to prevent it being right by the exhaust. Granted, this exhaust probably doesn't get even that hot. But that's like right next to the exhaust. I guess let's see how long the wiring is. See if we can reach. Okay, well that part definitely will reach. Let's see. I don't like that though, I really don't. All right, well, I think I'm gonna have to put this guy down here, just like that. We'll just have to try to kind of hide the wiring on the way over. We can go under the oil pan and then up. Hopefully it's long enough for that. We'll probably just leave it full length for now, run it over to there, and then do what we can with it later. But that's just, I've tried every other place. It's a big box, it don't fit many places. And this ignition coil actually uses the stock bracket. We should be able to bolt it in over here, like the stock one. Gotta redo this fan wiring, some janky fan relay wiring going on. Just like that. Boom. All right. You can see that goes just right where the factory coil would go, right under the battery spot. We're gonna get a smaller battery for here. We have a full size one and it looks so silly. It's about the size of the engine. So, but for now, we'll make it work. But yeah, so now let's get this guy mounted up firmly, affixed, and then we can run our wiring, and then we can spark test it and try to start it. We'll see if it's actually that simple, but you never know, could be. All right, actually, before we go mount the ignition box, we've got some more cleaning to do. We just got the top cleaned up, the engine bay area, and I can't bring myself to mount new shiny parts on a super dirty chassis. We need to get this cleaned up, and it'll save our future selves some headache because we're gonna be running the fuel lines underneath the car here soon. So what we're gonna use to clean it is a product from today's video sponsor, the Blaster Corp. So today we have their heavy duty engine degreaser. So I've used all sorts of products from the Blaster Corp. A lot of you are probably familiar with some of them, like PB Blaster, their penetrating oil, but this stuff is great. I've tried so many different engine degreasers, and most of the time they're a letdown. They don't do much at all. It's a huge disappointment, but this stuff has always worked really, really well for me. And we're gonna need all the cleaning power we can get, because normally I would spray the degreaser on, let it sit, not even scrub it, just spray it off with a pressure washer. But in this scenario, we can't really get under here with a pressure washer without soaking the whole shop. So we're gonna have to rely pretty much solely on the cleaning action of the degreaser to get the underside of this thing at least reasonably clean. You know, we're gonna have the engine out at some point and do a thorough clean with the pressure washer, but for now we just wanna get it to the point where we're not getting dirt and grime in our hair and on our hands every time we touch anything underneath this car. So with that being said, enough jibber jabber. Let's get to cleaning so then we can get them out in the ignition box, and then we can get to trying to start this thing. All right, well, as you can see by the mess we've made on the floor, we got a lot of the mess out from underneath the car. You can actually see now that the transmission is silver. What a huge difference that made. And that was only, I think, a can and a half. Yeah, here's the empty one. This one's half full. That's all we use. This stuff goes a long way, but it worked really well. Again, we'll do more cleaning when we have the drivetrain out and we can get onto all the cracks and crevices, but at least for now, it's clean enough to touch it and not get filthy. So that being said, huge shout out to the Blaster Corp for sponsoring today's video. It's so cool to work with a company whose products I've been using since I first started working on cars. I mean, the very first car project I did featured a can of PB Blaster, saving me from snapping off corroded bolts. And I've been a fan ever since, so it's really awesome to work with them and have them help support the channel. So huge shout out to the Blaster Corp. I'll put a link in the description if you want to check out any of their products. If you haven't tried anything yet, definitely highly recommend it. That being said, we're gonna get our mess cleaned up now off the floor, and then we're gonna drop this thing down, try to get this ignition box installed so that we can try to fire this thing up. So you know the deal. Enough jibber jabber, back to work. So now that we've determined where to mount the box, we just need to mark our holes and drill them. So I used a sized center punch. These come in kits and they come in a bunch of different sizes so they can fit snugly in a hole, and then you give them a little tap with a hammer and it perfectly marks your center, which is critical when dealing with holes like this. We can't open these up on this box, you know, they are where they are. So we needed to get this right the first time, and luckily we did. We got lucky there. So from there, we just need to bolt it up. Now, before we do that, we're gonna put some rubber on the back of it here to help isolate it from vibration. We don't want this thing rattling itself apart. Now, the kit actually comes with these rubber mounting bosses, but with where everything is down there, we don't really have the room to use them. So we improvised with a little rubber backing. I've used this on a lot of different types of ECUs and things like that. It's done me well thus far, so I think we'll be all right. Not the most ideal, but we gotta do what we gotta do to make this work in this engine bay. So with it mounted, we now have a fixed location. We can now terminate our wiring because we know how long it needs to be. So the first thing that I wanted to get wired up was the distributor connector. So we're using the stock connector off the stock engine harness and hooking that into the MSD wiring. So that way we don't have to cut the connector off the distributor in case we ever want to take this thing back to working with a stock ECU. So we get that crimped together, get it heat shrinked nicely, and then get it plugged into the distributor, and then we can just start plugging and playing everything in. So the way this works, there's really not much wiring going on here. So the distributor wire is what's basically telling the ignition box when to fire. We then have power and ground direct from the battery to the box. From there, we have two wires that go to the ignition coil that are going to tell it when to fire. And then we have a tach output and basically an ignition wire to turn the box on. It is really about as simple as it gets. So putting these wires direct to the battery is important. You don't want to go to a junction box with any type of electronic like this. It's always best to go direct to the battery. So fortunately, with this temporary battery that we have top post and side post. So we're able to bolt the wiring in for the box directly to its own spot on the battery without having to tap it into the top terminals, which always gets messy. So from there, we only need one more thing in the wiring department, and that is a good ground strap from the engine to the chassis. Grounds are critical. If you don't have good grounds, you will fight yourself. You will pull your hair out trying to figure out problems that are all related to just not having good grounding. So I wanted to make up a little bit heavier gauge wire for the ground that I could bolt directly from the head to the chassis to make sure we have good continuity between the two and we don't fight ourselves trying to figure out some problem. All right, box is mounted. Wiring is roughly hooked up. We're gonna loom this, make it all nice, route it better, but we wanna get it working first. So this wire is to the tack, which we're obviously not gonna use. This wire we don't use in our scenario. We'll tuck that guy down here for now, out of the way. This is gonna go to an ignition source when we turn the key on. This is going to our pickup wheel in the distributor to tell it when to fire. Those two wires go down to the coil. These wires go to the battery, and that's it. So the biggest question mark here is if the pickup in the distributor will be strong enough to tell the ignition box when to fire the coil. That's what I'm concerned about and not sure if it's gonna work right or not. We've got to plug in the plug wire, number 1 cylinder. We're gonna crank it over and see if we get spark there. So it's not, I need to find a better place for this. I guess that's a little better. So I guess let's try it. Let's try to crank it, see. Hopefully I can spot it from back there. So we'll now clip our, so that should be, yep, ignition box on. All right, let's give this a shot here. All right. We have spark. We have spark. All right, cool. That is great. That was easy. We'll need to check timing, but we have spark. Before I make this wiring all nice, I do want to get it actually started, at least with some starter fluid. I don't know if I have starter fluid, but we have spark. We have spark. That is huge. It sparked. We don't know if it's sparking at the right time. It's sparking though. That is big because that means it's reading our wheel in here and it is sending spark out, the coil is working, and it is firing, boom, we got spark at the plug. That's assumingly all systems go. We'll have to, again, check timing and make sure that it's the firing order and all that's fine, but that's good. Okay, that's good, that's exciting. All right, well, spark came a little bit easier than I thought. I'm not gonna count my chickens before they hatch. We don't know if that spark is at the right time or on all 4 cylinders, but it sparked. So since we're there, all we need to do to start this thing is seal up this intake. We can't start it with bolts that aren't tight, a leaking intake manifold gasket. So we need to pull these back off. I don't have the gasket, but I did go get some copper spray gasket. So we're gonna put some copper spray on it, bolt it down good, seal it up, and then I picked up some fuel, some good old starting fluid, so we can try to spray a little bit of that in there and see if we can't get this thing to at least light off. If we can, then it's all about messing with the carbs. That would be amazing. We'd be in really good shape, but again, not counting my chickens before they hatch. Let's take it one step at a time here. Let's get this carb kit back off, get the gasket sprayed, get it back on, and then try to kick the tires and light the fires. All right, for those of you who don't know what copper spray gasket is, it's basically a spray-on gasket maker. I used to use it all the time on my Miata when it was turbo, and I was reusing metal head gaskets a lot. I try to avoid using it on head gaskets these days, but for something like this, a metal gasket, it's basically like we're reapplying the coating. So we went ahead and got our gasket lathered up with some copper spray. This stuff normally comes out like spray paint, but this particular can just didn't quite have the pressure. It really ended up making a mess on my floor. I should have been a little more careful there, but we got it sprayed up. We let it tack up. You don't want to put it on while it's still soaking wet. You want to make sure it gets a little bit tacky first, and then we could start to install the carburetor setup. Now, we had to come up with a pretty unique bolt combination for this. We have 3 different types of bolts using 3 different types of tools, which is a big no-no for me. anyway. I hate having different types of hardware on the same thing, but in this scenario, to make everything work best, it's what we had to do. But I mean, if it works, it works. Oh, man, well, that was difficult. I often forget that, you know, this car doesn't have to be the most serviceable thing in the world. We're not doing 5-minute calls, trying to keep this thing on track, but I still like making things easy to work on. All right, so we've got to plug up our brake booster port down here, but we've also got to plug up our injector ports. The injectors actually port into the head instead of into the intake manifold. So even though we've changed the manifold and we've put carbs on it, we still have these ports to deal with. Now I ordered the block off plugs, I just didn't realize I needed them until I needed them. So they're on the way, but we're gonna plug them with some vacuum caps. Not the most ideal scenario, but it will work. It will work. Just need to keep air from going in there. Got my installer tool. Oh, this is just a size-specific center. This is not ideal. This is way less correct than I normally like to do things. Normally I would just wait, but I'm too antsy. Ports are plugged. I got this kit on Amazon. It's been pretty amazing, to be honest. I don't know if it's still on there, but if it is, I'll link it. I need to redo my Amazon links. All right, so here's where we're at. Injector ports are plugged. Not great, but they're plugged. Little seal for air. Vacuum port for the booster is plugged. Manifold is tightened down with copper spray gasket. Hopefully it seals well. Distributor wiring is there. We know it works. Nothing left to it but to do it, I guess. We'll see. Let's find out. So basically the way I've got this set up, I don't normally like to do this, but in this scenario, it's actually ideal. So this is basically me turning the key on to turn the ignition box on, and this is starter. This fires over the starter. Now again, I'm not normally fond of starting cars this way. I don't like to start them if I don't have things ready wiring-wise anyway, fuel system-wise, etc. But in this case, two things. One, we need to make sure the ignition system's good so we can clean it all up and move on. Thing two is we're working solo. So when you're working solo, it's ideal to be starting the car from out here because if anything happens, I'm right by the battery, I can disconnect it, I can get to a fire extinguisher, I can do all those things. Whereas if I'm in the car, that 5-10 seconds to get over here could be the difference between setting something on fire and not. So as janky as it is, it's kind of the ideal way to do it in our situation here. Actually tighten this positive plug. This is how you know this car has gone to a track for drifting. If the positive terminal is plugged, is covered. That's like the one thing that they will never let you buy with at most techs. You gotta have your battery positive covered. All right, moment of truth. I'm jibber jabbering, avoid the inevitable. Fire extinguisher is right here. Let's go. Yes, yes. That's so sick. I already heard that. Woo! I'm pumped. Don't need to get carried away with this, but I need a little more. I gotta do it another time. Just, you know, just for the funs of it. Let's go. Ignition box is working. All right, that is sick. All right, whew. I'm pumped. Okay, so now we just need to clean up this wiring. We need to figure out how we want to get starter signal, if I got to strip apart that harness or not. Probably before I go too deep there, I'm going to clean up the ignition box wiring, get it all wrapped, and then the next thing we need to do is a fuel system to the carbs. But I mean, it's firing right up, sounds good. I mean, for as good as you can tell with the thing on starting fluid. Dude, I'm pumped. I'm so pumped. This is the first time I've dug deep into doing a carb setup with an ignition box, and you know, there's not a lot of info on this because it's all from 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I was hoping that this would work. I thought it would work, but you never know, you know, and it just fired right up, like no problem. I'm gonna do a video for Ben. All right, another time. I was hoping we could get most of the way there without having to split this Johnny open and minimize what we don't need, but we're gonna have to, unfortunately. There's just some important things in here that we need that we don't have. That's probably why this thing wouldn't want to start half the time. Look at that wire. Can you see that? All right, I'm gonna start messing with this. I have to, okay, oh, I'm getting too distracted. I'm just so excited. We're so close. We really don't have much left to do to get this thing running and driving. This is the most exciting first start I've had in a while. That's great. I don't even know. It might be more exciting than the vet just because I was a lot less confident in this one. The vet, I was pretty confident was going to fire up. Yeah, wow. Sick. All right, let's pull this harness out and get it cleaned up. And then we'll go from there, okay? So I had a bit of a debate on how I wanted to clean this wiring up and loom it. I really wanted to use some heat shrink loom. It just looks so good and keeps everything so minimal and compact, but we don't know exactly what we're gonna do with this harness if we need to extend it, so I didn't wanna take all the connectors off, loom it up all nice, and then end up having to do something different with it anyway. So we just whipped out the old reliable Tessa tape. This stuff works really well. There's two types. There's the more cloth type and the more exterior type. But I mean, a lot of OEMs use this tape on their harnesses. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. It's a great, easy way to wrap a harness, keep it protected, give it the abrasion resistance it needs, and keep everything tucked up nicely and uniform. So we got it all taped. It's time to put it back in, check it all over, and obviously we got to see if it still works. Try to make sure it still works. Still works. We're good. Key off. All right, we got our wiring loomed up. I mean, it's a lot better not having straggly wires everywhere, but I'm still not super fond of it. I don't want this to leave this like this long term. You know, one of the beautiful things about this carb setup with the ignition box is that we need so few wires to run this. So I'd prefer not to have those few wires that we do need up front and center like this, because it kind of defeats some of the purpose. So we'll change that up, but I'd like to get the rest of the harness, whatever we do need, in here and see how that lays and routes out, and then worry about redoing this, whether we've got to extend it or just reroute it or whatever. For now, again, all about functionality, proof of concept, get it running, get it driving, go from there. So that being said, next step is the fuel system. That's really our next big hurdle. If we put fuel to these carbs and everything works as it should, we don't have any major malfunctions, we should be about ready to drive this. So that's the next step, get the fuel system working. If that goes well, then we can dial in the harness, get it stripped down, thinned out, just what we need, get it routed so that way everything works off the key like it should. And then we can try to drive it. And then if that goes well, we can start working on the chassis stuff and hopefully be driving this thing here in a couple weeks. So I'm pumped, man. Just hearing the induction noise from the velocity stacks, even for those couple of seconds, put the biggest smile on my face. I have always wanted a setup like this in a car since the beginning of time, since before I had my first car. I wanted an AE86 specifically, you know, with ITBs, and that changed to side drafts, but this is something I've wanted for a long time. It's been a bucket list combination of mine. And to hear it come to life for the first time, it is a special moment for sure. So that being said, next step is the fuel system. However, I'm waiting on a couple little pieces to switch it over from EFI fuel system to carb fuel system. So they should be here tomorrow or the next day. But we don't have them in our hands right now, so we're kind of out of time, out of things to do until those pop in and we can finish that up. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and end it here, but I do want to say thank you for watching, thanks for subscribing, and that I hope to see you next time. Should be driving this thing soon. Stay tuned. All right, goodbye.